Setting the stage. What did beautiful even mean in the Middle Ages? When you think about beauty standards, your brain probably jumps straight to things like Hollywood actors, Instagram filters, or maybe the endless ads for skincare products that promised to fix problems you didn't even know you had. But beauty in the Middle Ages? That was a whole different ballgame. In fact, the rules for what counted as attractive back then might sound pretty strange to us today. And honestly, that's kind of the fun of it. So, let's set the stage. The medieval period lasted for roughly 1,000 years, from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the beginning of the Renaissance in the 15th century. That's a huge stretch of time. It's important to remember that beauty ideals weren't the same everywhere, or even every century. What a 12th century French nobleman thought was gorgeous might not have impressed a 14th century Italian merchant. Still, there were some common themes. First off, beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was tied up with ideas of morality, class, and even health. To be beautiful was, in many people's eyes, to be good, wealthy, and even blessed by God. At the same time, being ugly wasn't just unlucky, it was sometimes seen as a sign of bad character. Not fair, but definitely the way many medieval folks thought. Beauty as status symbol. One of the first things to understand is that beauty was often less about nature and more about nurture, or, to be blunt, about money. If you were rich, you could afford to take care of your body, eat well, and wear fine clothes. The nobility and upper classes had the time and resources to chase after beauty trends. Meanwhile, peasants and laborers? Well, their looks were more shaped by hard work, sun exposure, and the general grind of survival. So when nobles praised pale skin, silky hair, or soft hands, it wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about separating themselves from the sweaty, tanned, calloused masses. In other words, beautiful in the Middle Ages often meant, I don't have to work in the fields all day. Religion and beauty. Another big factor was religion. The church was a powerful influence, and it had a complicated relationship with beauty. On the one hand, many church leaders preached that vanity was sinful and that people should avoid focusing too much on their looks. On the other hand, there was also the belief that physical beauty reflected inner goodness, and that God had blessed the beautiful more than the plain. Talk about mixed signals. This created a constant tug of war. People wanted to look their best, but not so much that they looked vain or sinful. So a lot of medieval beauty was about striking that careful balance, attractive enough to win admiration, modest enough to avoid gossip, and hopefully holy enough to keep your soul out of trouble. Health equals beauty. Back then, medicine and beauty often went hand in hand. To medieval minds, good health and good looks were almost the same thing. A glowing, pale complexion was a sign that your body's humors, those four mysterious fluids doctors love to talk about, were balanced. A sickly or spotted face? That was a clue something was off in your body, or worse, your soul. This is why so many beauty routines were tied to herbal remedies, ointments, and diets. People weren't just trying to look good, they were trying to stay alive in a world where plague, famine, and mystery diseases were lurking around every corner. Beauty in the eyes of men and women. So what about gender differences? For women, beauty was often tied to fertility and modesty. A beautiful woman was supposed to look delicate, pale, and a little bit otherworldly, like she'd just stepped out of a church painting. Too much makeup or showiness, though, could backfire. People might accuse you of being vain or even of dabbling in witchcraft. For men, beauty was often about strength, nobility, and a commanding presence. A knight was supposed to look both handsome and intimidating, like someone who could joust in shining armor but also recite poetry afterward. Scholars and churchmen had a different vibe, clean, tidy, and a bit more subdued, but still with an emphasis on grooming and presentation. The role of art and literature. If you want to know what people thought was beautiful, look at their art and read their poetry. Medieval paintings and manuscripts show women with pale skin, long flowing hair, and serene expressions. Men were often painted with chiseled features, noble stances, and sharp eyes. Poets went on and on about rosy cheeks, bright eyes, golden hair, and slender hands. Sure, it was idealized, but that's what standards are, a mix of fantasy and reality. Of course, art didn't always reflect the average person. Most people didn't look like saints or fairy tale knights. But ideals have power, and they shaped how people judged themselves and others. A world without mirrors. Here's another thing to keep in mind. Most people in the Middle Ages didn't have mirrors the way we do today. Glass mirrors were rare and expensive, so people couldn't obsess over every tiny detail of their appearance the way modern folks can under fluorescent bathroom lighting. Instead, beauty was often judged in social spaces, how you looked at church, in the marketplace, or at a festival. Your beauty was about the impression you gave to others, not necessarily the reflection you saw in the mirror. This probably saved a lot of medieval people from the kind of insecurity we deal with today. No one was zooming in on their pores or counting split ends. On the downside, your reputation for beauty could spread by gossip just as quickly as by actual looks. Setting the mood for the journey ahead. So, what did beautiful mean in the Middle Ages? In short, it meant pale skin, clear features, good health, modest presentation, and a whole lot of social signaling. But it also meant something deeper, being seen as virtuous, wealthy, or divinely favored. Beauty wasn't just about looking good, it was about where you stood in the world. And that's just the beginning. In the chapters ahead, we'll dive into the specific details, the hairstyles, the cosmetics, the dangerous recipes people used to get the look, and even how different regions of Europe had their own spins on beauty. Spoiler alert, some of it gets weird, some of it gets dangerous, and some of it sounds surprisingly modern. But for now, you can think of medieval beauty as a kind of stage play. Everyone had a role to play, whether noble or peasant, man or woman, and their appearance was part of the performance. The audience wasn't just neighbors or strangers. In their eyes, God himself was watching too. Not exactly the kind of pressure you want while deciding if your new haircut looks okay. The pale complexion craze. If you've ever been told you look healthy because you got a little sun, congratulations, you would have been considered tragically unattractive in much of medieval Europe. Back then, a sun-kissed glow was basically the opposite of a compliment. Pale, almost ghostly skin was the ultimate beauty goal, and people were willing to go to wild lengths to get it. Why? Well, in the Middle Ages, your skin color wasn't just about looks. It was about what kind of life you lived. Pale skin meant one thing loud and clear: you were rich enough to stay indoors. Why? Pale meant power for nobles and the wealthy. Being pale was like wearing a badge of honor. It showed the world that you didn't have to toil under the sun all day. You weren't out there plowing fields, tending sheep, or sweating in workshops. Nope, you were safe inside stone halls, sipping wine, embroidering, reading prayers, or giving orders. Peasants, on the other hand, had no choice but to be outside constantly. Their skin tanned, freckled, and weathered by wind and dirt. So, the contrast was obvious. Tan skin equaled labor and poverty. Pale skin equaled wealth and refinement. In a way, pale skin was the medieval version of having a luxury car or a designer handbag. It silently shouted, "I don't need to work like you." The dangerous quest for paleness. But here's where it gets a little scary. Not everyone was naturally pale, of course. And just like today, when people chase beauty standards they can't naturally meet, medieval folks turn to questionable methods. One of the most common tricks was to apply powders and creams made with white lead, chalk, or even ground-up alabaster. Yep, you heard that right, lead. People were literally smearing poison on their faces to look fashionable. Over time, this could cause skin damage, hair loss, or even death. But hey, at least they looked good while it lasted, kind of. Other recipes included vinegar mixed with egg whites, crushed pearls, or powdered bones. If you've ever opened your fridge and seen old eggs, you know that can't have been pleasant. But the logic was simple: if it made your skin lighter, it was worth it. Covering up the sun, of course, prevention was better than cure. The wealthy did everything they could to avoid the sun in the first place. Women wore wide-brimmed hats, veils, and long sleeves, even in the summer heat. They carried parasols or simply stayed indoors during the day. Men of the upper classes weren't quite as covered up, but they too tried to limit their sun exposure. After all, looking too rustic wasn't a good look for a knight or a nobleman. You can picture the scene. While peasants were sweating in the fields, nobles were hiding in cool stone chambers, muttering, "Nope, it'll take ghostly pale over farmer's tan." Thank you very much. A gender twist: paleness was especially emphasized for women. A pale face with rosy cheeks was considered the ultimate sign of delicate femininity. It meant you were pure, modest, and free from the roughness of the outdoors. A woman who tanned too much might be whispered about. Was she too wild, too free, too unladylike? For men, pale skin was admired too, but with some wiggle room. Knights, soldiers, and laboring men could get away with being a little tanned, since toughness was part of their appeal. Still, the most refined men, especially at court, were expected to keep their skin light and smooth. Cheeks and contrasts: interestingly, while pale skin was the goal, people also liked a hint of contrast. Think pale complexion with a subtle blush on the cheeks. To achieve this, women used natural dyes from plants like madder or crushed berries to create a rosy tint. It wasn't about looking sun-kissed, it was about looking fresh and lively without ever having stepped outdoors. In fact, this balance, snow-white skin with just a pop of pink, shows up again and again in medieval poetry and art. A rose and lily combination, they called it, the white of the lily, the red of the rose. And just like modern influencers chasing the no-makeup look, medieval women worked hard to look effortlessly delicate. The church's opinion, of course, the church always had something to say. Too much fussing with your complexion could be seen as vanity, which was frowned upon. But on the flip side, pale skin was often linked to holiness. Saints in paintings were shown with luminous, pale faces, glowing as if touched by heaven. So, pale skin wasn't just fashionable, it could be interpreted as a sign of spiritual purity. It's a little ironic, isn't it? People were smearing on poisonous creams to look pure and holy. But hey, contradictions were kind of the Middle Ages' specialty. Class and geography now, we should point out that not every region in Europe was obsessed with the same level of ghostly whiteness. In sunny southern regions like Spain or Italy, people accepted a bit more color as natural. Still, among the elite, paleness was always seen as more refined, even if it was harder to maintain in a warm climate. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, where sunlight was limited for much of the year, paleness came more naturally, and so the obsession was even stronger. A lady in England or France could proudly flaunt her snow-white skin while sipping watered-down wine, knowing she was on trend. The pale standard today: it might be tempting to laugh at medieval people chasing paleness with chalk and arsenic, but if you think about it, the logic isn't that different from modern beauty trends. We still tie skin tone to status in some ways. Tanned skin today often suggests leisure time spent on vacation, while luxury skincare ads still sell the idea of flawless, glowing skin. So maybe the medieval obsession with pale faces isn't as far removed from us as it seems. We've just swapped parasols for tanning salons and chalk powders for retinol creams. Wrapping it up so, the pale complexion craze of the Middle Ages wasn't just a quirky beauty fad. It was a powerful symbol of class, purity, and even morality. Pale skin said, "I am rich, I am refined, and I am closer to God than you are." And people were willing to do whatever it took, whether staying indoors all summer, layering on powders, or risking their health with toxic creams. In the end, the pursuit of paleness is a perfect example of how beauty standards aren't just about appearance. They're about the stories people tell themselves and others. Stories about wealth, virtue, health, and status. And in the medieval world, that story was painted in pale white. Hair goals of the Middle Ages. If there's one thing that has never gone out of style, it's obsessing over hair. Fast forward through the centuries, and you'll always find people fussing with it, dyeing it, cutting it, curling it, or trying to make it do the one thing it refuses to do naturally. The Middle Ages were no different. In fact, hair was such a big deal back then that poets and painters sometimes talked about it more than eyes, lips, or even body shape. Your hair wasn't just hair, it was a billboard advertising your beauty, your status, and sometimes even your soul. So, what exactly were the hair goals of the medieval world? Let's brush through it together. Blonde ambition. Let's start with the big one, blonde hair. If you had golden locks in medieval Europe, you were basically winning the beauty lottery. Writers compared blonde hair to sunshine, gold, or even holy light. It was seen as angelic, pure, and irresistible. Fair-haired heroines filled romance stories, and saints in religious paintings often had glowing blonde curls. The problem? Most people weren't naturally blonde. In fact, across much of Europe, darker shades of brown were far more common. So, just like today, when everyone suddenly wants the hair color they weren't born with, medieval folks turned to creative methods. Homemade bleaching concoctions included rinsing hair with chamomile tea, saffron, or vinegar, then sitting out in the sun for hours to activate it. In Italy, women even perched on rooftops with their hair spread out under wide-brimmed hats that exposed only their locks to the sunlight, protecting their skin while letting their strands soak up the rays. Imagine a whole neighborhood of ladies sitting on the roof, hair sizzling like lasagna under the summer sun. Long hair, don't care, mostly for women, length mattered too. Long, flowing hair was considered the ultimate sign of feminine beauty. The longer the hair, the more youthful, fertile, and elegant you looked. This is why so many medieval maidens in art are shown with waist-length tresses tumbling gracefully down their backs. Of course, most women didn't walk around with their hair streaming in public. Modesty rules meant that married women were expected to cover their hair with veils, wimples, or hoods. Letting your hair flow freely in public could be seen as scandalous, or at least very flirtatious. But in private, or on special occasions, showing off your long, shiny hair was like pulling out your fanciest jewelry. Unmarried women, on the other hand, were freer to display their hair. A young girl with uncovered long locks was basically announcing, "Yes, I am single, and yes, my hair is fabulous." Hairstyles and social class. Hairstyles weren't just about beauty, they were about class and status. The richer you were, the more elaborate your hair could be. Wealthy women styled their hair into braids, buns, or even towers held up with wireframes and decorated with jewels, ribbons, or veils. Imagine balancing a mini construction project on your head and then trying to nod politely at dinner without knocking over your goblet. Peasant women, by contrast, usually wore their hair simpler, braided, tied back, or covered with a plain kerchief. Not because they didn't care, but because when you're busy milking cows or hauling water, you don't have 3 hours to build an architectural wonder on your scalp. Men and their manes. So what about men? Well, they had their own version of hair standards. In the earlier Middle Ages, shoulder-length hair on men was pretty common, sometimes even styled into curls or waves. Think more medieval rock star than medieval monk. Beards came in and out of fashion depending on the era. Some periods favored clean-shaven faces, especially among knights and nobles who wanted to show off their youthful vigor. Other times, a full, well-kept beard was the height of manly attractiveness, signaling wisdom, strength, and virility. But here's the twist. Monks, priests, and scholars often shaved their heads in a style called a tonsure, leaving a little ring of hair around the scalp. Not exactly the sexiest look, but it screamed holy dedication. It's safe to say no medieval maiden was swooning over a tonsured head. Hair color hierarchy: blonde may have been the superstar shade, but other colors had their reputations too. Red hair was a mixed bag. Sometimes it was admired for its fiery uniqueness, but it was also linked to hot tempers, lust, or even witchcraft. Poor redheads couldn't catch a break. Black hair was associated with mystery, seriousness, and intensity. It could be admired, but in poetry, black-haired women were often described as more dangerous or exotic. Brown hair, the most common, wasn't usually celebrated in poems, but it was perfectly acceptable. Think of it as the safe middle ground. Basically, hair color wasn't just about looks, it was like a personality quiz you couldn't escape. Hair care and maintenance now. Before you imagine medieval people with perfect shampoo commercial hair, let's pause. Hair care wasn't exactly easy. People washed less often than we do now, and hot water baths weren't a daily luxury. But that doesn't mean they didn't care. They used herbal rinses, like rosemary, sage, or nettle, to clean and freshen their hair. Oils and ointments were applied to add shine or tame frizz. Combs made of wood or bone were popular tools, and lice combs were a must-have accessory. Yes, lice were a thing. Imagine writing a romantic poem about golden locks while secretly hoping she doesn't have little critters crawling around in there. Symbolism of hair wasn't just a fashion statement, it was symbolic. In art, loose hair often represented youth, virginity, or freedom. Covered hair symbolized modesty and respectability. Cutting hair could even be a punishment or a sign of shame. For example, women accused of crimes or immoral behavior sometimes had their hair publicly shorn as humiliation. Meanwhile, in religious life, hair was tied to humility. Nuns shaved their heads or wore veils to show they had renounced worldly vanity. Priests shaved theirs to mark spiritual devotion. So, while one lady was bleaching her hair to look like a golden goddess, another was tucking it all away in the name of God. Hair in art and romance. If you want to know how much hair mattered, just look at medieval art and literature. Lovers wrote poems comparing locks of hair to rays of the sun or threads of spun gold. Knights dreamed of their lady's braid as a token before going off to battle. In paintings, artists spent incredible detail showing glossy strands, often halo-like, around the heads of saints and angels. Hair wasn't just an accessory, it was part of the storytelling of beauty, virtue, and desire. Wrapping it up, so, what were the hair goals of the Middle Ages? For women, long, flowing, preferably blonde, and carefully styled to signal your status. For men, healthy, well-kept, sometimes long, sometimes bearded, but always groomed enough to show you weren't just a scruffy peasant. Hair was a symbol, a fashion, a spiritual statement, and a never-ending source of stress. Sound familiar? Yep, people have been fussing over their hair for centuries, and medieval folks were no exception. The ideal female body. When you picture the ideal body, your mind probably goes to whatever modern magazines, Instagram feeds, or fitness ads are pushing right now. Maybe it's flat stomachs, maybe it's curves, maybe it's something else entirely. But back in the Middle Ages, the idea of the perfect female body was just as specific, and just as unrealistic, as it is today. Only instead of Photoshop filters, they had poetry, paintings, and a whole lot of judgment from society and the church. So what exactly did the medieval world think the perfect woman's body looked like? Let's take a closer look. A body of contradictions. Here's the thing. Medieval beauty ideals were never completely consistent. Over 1,000 years, across dozens of cultures, tastes shifted a lot. But if you boil it down, there were a few common themes. The perfect medieval woman was supposed to look soft, delicate, and just a little fragile. Strength and muscle weren't admired in women. In fact, too much sturdiness could be seen as peasant-like. At the same time, though, curves were celebrated. A round face, a bit of fullness in the hips, and even a soft belly could be admired, because these suggested fertility and health. So, on one hand, fragile and delicate. On the other, curvy and fertile. Basically, a balancing act between ethereal angel and healthy mother. Not exactly an easy standard to hit. The face of beauty. Before we even get to the body, the face carried huge weight in medieval beauty standards. A pale complexion, small mouth, delicate nose, and large, shining eyes were considered ideal. Rounder faces were admired too. Sharp cheekbones or hollow features could be seen as signs of illness or hardship. Think about how different that is from many modern ideals, where angular features often dominate fashion magazines. In the Middle Ages, softness was key. Shapes and silhouettes for women's bodies. Medieval art and poetry often praised a shape that was neither skinny nor overly plump, but somewhere in between. A narrow waist was admired, but it didn't need to be impossibly small. The idea of hourglass curves existed, but in a more natural, rounded way compared to the exaggerated versions pushed in later centuries. Breasts were often described in literature, usually as modest, high, or round like apples. The focus wasn't on size so much as on youthfulness and symmetry. A sagging chest, of course, was seen as less attractive, which is a little unfair considering gravity is undefeated. Hips and thighs were linked to fertility. Fuller hips meant childbearing ability, which was highly valued in a society that relied heavily on big families for survival. But too much weight could also be judged as gluttonous or lazy. Once again, women were walking a tightrope between two extremes. Fashion's role, of course, clothing did a lot to shape how women's bodies were perceived. Early medieval gowns were fairly loose and shapeless, which meant beauty was less about curves and more about the face, hair, and hands. By the 14th and 15th centuries, though, fashion started to highlight the figure more. Gowns were tailored to fit closer to the body, sometimes with laces that cinched the waist. Suddenly, the silhouette mattered more. A slim torso with a rounded bust and gentle curves became the look of the time. Corsets in the extreme sense didn't exist yet, but women still used fabric lacing and fitted bodices to sculpt their shapes. Basically, medieval shapewear. Not quite as suffocating as Victorian corsets would become, but definitely still uncomfortable. The Virgin versus the Mother. Here's where things get complicated. The church had a huge influence on beauty ideals, and that meant women were often caught between two contradictory models, the Virgin Mary and the fertile mother. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate symbol of purity, modesty, and spiritual beauty. She was often shown in art with a slim, graceful body, delicate hands, and a peaceful expression. Women were encouraged to emulate her modesty and restraint. At the same time, society also prized women as mothers, which meant fertility was hugely important. A woman who looked healthy enough to bear children, soft curves, wide hips, youthful skin, was considered attractive. So women were expected to look both modest and fertile, ethereal yet practical. It's like being told to be a saint and a supermom at the same time. No pressure. The role of class body ideals also shifted depending on class. For noble women, being thin was less of a priority than looking soft and well-fed. A body that showed you had enough to eat was admired, because famine and scarcity were common. Being too thin could signal poverty or sickness. For peasant women, though, the standards were different. They needed strength to survive daily labor, so their bodies naturally developed more muscle and sturdiness. This didn't always fit the delicate ideals celebrated in noble courts, but within their own communities, health and strength were valued traits. After all, a woman who could work the fields and survive harsh winters was far more practical than someone who fainted at the sight of mud. Art and poetry as guides. If you want a snapshot of what was considered beautiful, look at medieval poetry. Poets often described women's bodies in flowery, exaggerated ways. A lover might praise his lady's snow-white skin, her slender waist, her round hips, or her chest like two perfect apples. Subtlety was not their strong point. Art, too, reflected ideals. From illuminated manuscripts to church frescoes, women were often painted with soft curves, modest chests, and flowing gowns that hinted at their shapes without revealing too much. Again, it was all about balance, attractive but not scandalous. Reality check now. Did most women actually look like the ideals sung about in poetry? Of course not. The average medieval woman, especially among the peasantry, had a body shaped by work, childbirth, and survival. Calloused hands, suntanned skin, and sturdy builds were far more common than delicate pale figures. But ideals are rarely about reality, they're about fantasy. Just like today, medieval women compared themselves to impossible standards set by the wealthy, the poets, and the artists. And just like today, those standards were influenced by class, health, and culture. Wrapping it up, so, the ideal female body in the Middle Ages was soft but not too soft, curvy but not too curvy, fertile but still modest, and always, always, pale. Women were expected to embody a whole bundle of contradictions, juggling saintliness, sensuality, and social class all at once. At the end of the day, these beauty ideals said less about individual women and more about what society wanted from them: purity, fertility, and obedience to social rules. A lot to ask of anyone, especially in an age without modern medicine, mirrors, or even decent heating in winter. Male beauty standards. When we talk about beauty standards, women usually get most of the attention. But don't worry. Men in the Middle Ages weren't just roaming around looking scruffy and unbothered. Nope, they had their own set of expectations to live up to. And while the ideals for men were different from those for women, they were just as strict, just as tied to class, and, let's be honest, just as unrealistic. So what made a man handsome back then? Let's step into the medieval barber shop and find out. Tall, strong, and noble. First things first, height mattered. Being tall was seen as a clear sign of strength, authority, and superiority. A tall man was automatically more commanding, whether he was leading soldiers into battle or just trying to look impressive at a feast. Broad shoulders and a sturdy frame were also admired. The ideal man looked like he could swing a sword, ride a horse into battle, and carry a shield for hours without breaking a sweat. In other words, the medieval version of an action hero. Think less about six-pack abs and more about a knight who could keep you alive during a siege. The ideal face. Now let's move up to the face. Medieval poetry and art often praised men with strong jawlines, high foreheads, and straight noses. Bright, clear eyes were a must, since eyes were thought to reveal a person's character. A man with sharp, alert eyes looked courageous and noble. Skin mattered too, though not quite as much as for women. Pale skin was still admired, since it hinted at wealth and refinement. But a little color from being outdoors wasn't a deal-breaker for men. After all, knights and soldiers were expected to fight under the sun. What mattered most was that your skin looked healthy and free of disease. Hair and grooming. Just like women, men's hair sent big messages about their beauty and their status. In some eras, long flowing hair on men was considered attractive and noble. Picture a knight riding into battle with golden locks spilling out from under his helmet. Poetic, right? But styles changed. In later centuries, shorter haircuts became fashionable among nobles, signaling cleanliness and sophistication. Too much shaggy hair could look wild or peasant-like. Facial hair was another big debate. In some regions and times, beards were seen as masculine, wise, and powerful. A thick beard could signal maturity and strength. In other periods, though, being clean-shaven was preferred, especially at court, where smooth skin looked youthful and refined. Either way, grooming mattered. A messy beard or unkempt hair wasn't going to win you many admirers. Barbers, who doubled as surgeons, by the way, made good money trimming, shaving, and styling men to fit the latest trends. Clothes make the man. A man's attractiveness wasn't just about his body or face, it was also about what he wore. Wealthy men flaunted their status with fine fabrics, bright colors, and tailored tunics. Silk, velvet, and fur were the medieval equivalent of designer labels. Sumptuary laws, rules that controlled who could wear what, made sure peasants didn't accidentally outdress their betters. So if you saw a man in rich fabrics, you knew right away he was powerful and wealthy. And in the Middle Ages, wealth was one of the biggest beauty boosts you could get. Armor, too, was part of the ideal. A knight in shining armor wasn't just about battle readiness, it was a beauty statement. Gleaming metal, a perfectly fitted suit, and a plumed helmet turned warriors into walking fashion models. The knightly ideal knights really were the poster boys of medieval male beauty. They combined physical strength, noble behavior, and flashy armor into one irresistible package. Chivalric romances painted knights as brave, handsome, and endlessly loyal to their ladies. Strong arms from wielding weapons, a proud stance, and a commanding presence were all part of the look. And because knights were also supposed to be courteous and well-mannered, beauty wasn't just about appearance. It was about character. A handsome knight was brave, virtuous, and maybe just a little dramatic in his declarations of love. The scholarly look. Not every man could or wanted to be a knight. For those in the church or in scholarly circles, the beauty standard was a little different. Priests, monks, and educated men were expected to look neat, clean, and well-groomed, but not flashy. A high forehead, believed to signal intelligence, was admired. Some men even plucked their hairlines back to make their foreheads look bigger. Basically, medieval receding hairline chic. Simple robes and modest grooming reflected a different kind of attractiveness, wisdom, and spiritual authority instead of brute strength. So while knights embodied physical beauty, scholars and clerics represented intellectual or moral beauty. Different vibes, same pressure. Body size and shape. Interestingly, being too thin wasn't seen as attractive in men. A lean, wiry frame might look weak or sickly, which was not a good look in a world that valued strength and vitality. A little sturdiness, broad chest, muscular arms, and strong legs, was preferred. On the other hand, being too heavy could suggest greed or laziness. So, like women, men were expected to strike a balance, strong and sturdy, but not gluttonous. Basically, the dad bod of medieval Europe, but with more chainmail. Smells and hygiene. Believe it or not, hygiene played a role in male beauty too. Bad smells were not attractive, and people in the Middle Ages knew it. Wealthy men used scented waters, herbs, or even perfumes to freshen up. Bathing wasn't daily, but it was more common than we sometimes imagine, especially for the rich. Clean hands, trimmed nails, and fresh breath were all part of the package. After all, it's hard to win over a lady with flowery poems if you smell like yesterday's goat pen. Male beauty as power. At the end of the day, male beauty was closely tied to power. A handsome man wasn't just physically appealing, he looked strong enough to lead, wealthy enough to command respect, and noble enough to reflect well on his family. Beauty was less about delicate features and more about projecting authority. This is why medieval art often shows noblemen standing tall, wearing rich clothes, and carrying symbols of power, swords, books, or staffs. Their attractiveness came not just from their faces, but from the aura of control and respectability they projected. Wrapping it up, so, what made a man beautiful in the Middle Ages? Height, strength, broad shoulders, a noble face, and well-groomed hair all helped. Add in wealth, fine clothes, and maybe a suit of shining armor, and you had the full package. But just like women, men lived under the weight of beauty standards too. They had to balance strength with refinement, nobility with humility, and fashion with modesty. No one escaped the pressure. Eyes, brows, and medieval makeup tricks. If the eyes are the windows to the soul, then medieval folks were very busy cleaning and decorating those windows. Eyes and eyebrows played a huge role in beauty standards, and people went to some interesting lengths to make them look just right. Forget Instagram filters or a trip to Sephora. This was all about herbs, minerals, and the occasional dangerous chemical. Let's take a closer look. The eyes have it big. Bright eyes were the medieval gold standard. Poets wrote endlessly about ladies with eyes like stars, sapphires, or pools of water so deep you could drown in them. A wide, open gaze suggested innocence, purity, and even a kind of heavenly beauty. The church, always lurking in the background of beauty trends, liked the idea of eyes that looked upward to God instead of downward to temptation. For men, sharp, alert eyes suggested courage and intelligence. No one wanted to be painted with dull, half-lidded eyes. It looked like you were lazy or not all there upstairs. Of course, not everyone was blessed with naturally radiant peepers. Which brings us to the tricks. Homemade eye drops. One popular practice was using eye drops to make the eyes look clearer and brighter. These weren't your gentle pharmacy options either. Some drops were made with herbs like fennel or rosemary, which actually could soothe tired eyes. Not bad. Others, however, contained way harsher stuff, like copper salts or even belladonna. Belladonna, which literally means beautiful woman in Italian, was used later in the Renaissance to dilate pupils, making the eyes look wide and alluring. The problem? It's poisonous. Using it too much could cause blurry vision or even blindness. Talk about suffering for beauty. The brow game. Now onto eyebrows. Today, brows go through endless cycles: bushy, penciled, laminated, bleached. But in the Middle Ages, the standard was thin and delicate. Women plucked their brows into fine lines to emphasize their foreheads, which were considered a very attractive feature. A high, smooth forehead was thought to signal nobility and intelligence. Some women even plucked not just their brows but the hair along their hairlines to make their foreheads look bigger. Imagine willingly giving yourself a receding hairline because it was considered chic. That was the vibe. Men's brows were expected to be neat, not wild. Heavy, bushy brows could look brutish. A clean, defined brow suggested refinement and self-control. So yes, medieval grooming included eyebrow maintenance. Cheeks, lips, and the touch of color. The Middle Ages weren't entirely colorless when it came to makeup. Rouge for the cheeks and lips was a popular way to look fresh and healthy. A little pink in the cheeks suggested good circulation and vitality. Too much, though, and you risked looking like you'd had one too many ales at the tavern. Most rouges were homemade, mixed from natural ingredients like madder root, crushed flowers, or even red wine. Wealthier folks sometimes used powdered cinnabar, which contains mercury. It gave a brilliant red, but also slowly poisoned you over time. Imagine your beauty routine shaving years off your life. Not ideal. For lips, subtle color was admired. A little tint to make them look soft and appealing, but nothing too dramatic. Bold lipstick was more associated with actresses, entertainers, or women of ill repute. Skin smoothness and powders. The smoothness of skin mattered too. Both men and women sometimes applied powders to soften their complexion and hide blemishes. Chalk, ground rice, and crushed pearls were all used. Pearls sound luxurious, but chalk was probably more common. Unfortunately, lead-based powders were also popular in certain regions. Lead gave a pale, flawless finish, right up until it gave you skin damage, headaches, or worse. Once again, beauty products doubled as medieval biohazards. Eyelashes and lids. Eyelashes weren't quite as obsessed over as today, but they weren't ignored. Long lashes were sometimes praised in poetry, but people didn't have mascara or falsies to boost them. Instead, they might darken them with soot or burnt cork, which worked like a primitive eyeliner. Darkening the eyelids was also a trick borrowed from older traditions, especially in places influenced by trade with the Middle East. A little touch of kohl-like powder around the eyes could make them stand out dramatically. But again, it depended on the region and the century. In some places, painted eyes were seen as exotic or even sinful. The church didn't love makeup, especially when it looked unnatural. Teeth and smile touch-ups. While not exactly eye or brow related, the smile ties it all together. White, even teeth were admired, but people didn't have orthodontists to help them out. To brighten teeth, they sometimes rubbed them with cloths dipped in sage, salt, or even crushed charcoal. For breath, mint leaves or spices were chewed before social events. After all, what's the use of big, sparkling eyes if your smile knocks someone out cold? The gender divide. It's worth noting that women were more pressured to use these beauty tricks than men. A lady was expected to enhance her natural gifts, while a man's beauty was tied more to strength, power, and grooming. But that didn't stop some men, especially wealthy or vain ones, from experimenting with powders and scents. Looking sharp wasn't just a woman's game. Danger in the routine. The darker side of medieval beauty is how dangerous some of these enhancements could be. Lead powders, mercury-based rouges, poisonous eye drops. People were literally risking blindness, illness, or death in the pursuit of looking good. And yet, the risks didn't stop the trends. Just like today, when people undergo extreme procedures for beauty, medieval folks accepted the dangers as part of the price of fitting in. Vanity, it seems, has always been stronger than common sense. Wrapping it up. So, in the Middle Ages, your beauty arsenal included plucked eyebrows, a high forehead, bright white eyes, preferably not poisoned by belladonna, and just enough color in your cheeks and lips to look healthy. Maybe add a touch of powder to even out the skin, and if you were daring, a little soot for those lashes. It was a delicate balance between natural and enhanced, between looking modest enough for the church but polished enough to turn heads at court. Teeth, breath, and hygiene myths. When most people imagine the Middle Ages, they picture peasants with rotting teeth, nobles with bad breath, and an overall smell that could knock you over from 20 paces. Movies and TV love to play up the dirty medieval stereotype. But here's the twist: hygiene and dental care back then were not as bad as you probably think. Sure, there were limits, no minty toothpaste commercials or ultrasonic toothbrushes, but medieval folks weren't totally clueless. In fact, they cared a lot about their smiles, their breath, and yes, even their body odor. So let's set aside the myths and take a closer look at how medieval people handled the not-so-glamorous side of beauty. Teeth. Not as bad as the myths. Believe it or not, most medieval Europeans had better teeth than people in later centuries. Why? Sugar. Or rather, the lack of it. Sugar was rare and expensive in most of Europe until the late Middle Ages, so cavities were less common. Compare that to the 17th and 18th centuries, when sugar addiction swept across Europe, and people's teeth started crumbling like old castles. Medieval diets were tough on the jaw, though. Bread often contained bits of grit from the grinding stones used at mills, which wore teeth down over time. So while people weren't walking around with blackened stumps, their teeth might be a little ground down by middle age. Cleaning the pearly whites to keep teeth clean, medieval folks used all kinds of methods. Tooth powders were popular among the wealthy. These powders might include crushed herbs, spices, charcoal, or even ground eggshells. People would rub them on their teeth with cloth or their fingers. Toothbrushes weren't common in Europe until much later, but a good cloth and some minty powder did the trick. Some recipes sound surprisingly familiar. A 14th century text recommended mixing sage and salt for cleaning teeth, basically medieval herbal toothpaste. Charcoal, another common ingredient, is still sold in fancy whitening toothpastes today. Seems like they were onto something. Dealing with bad breath, okay, so they could clean their teeth, but what about bad breath? After all, medieval food was heavy on garlic, onions, and spices. Not exactly a recipe for minty freshness. To fix this, people chewed parsley, mint, fennel seeds, or cloves. Wealthier folks might carry little boxes of spices and pop a clove before speaking to someone important. If you could afford exotic imports, cinnamon was another breath freshener. Basically, medieval breath mints, pocket-sized, plant-based, and completely chewable. And if your breath was really bad? Some medieval medical texts suggested rinsing with wine or vinegar. Harsh but maybe effective. Medieval dentists, yes, they existed. What about when things went wrong? Well, dentistry was a bit of a gamble. There were no orthodontists to give you braces, but there were people who specialized in pulling teeth. Barbers, who also did bloodletting and minor surgeries, doubled as medieval dentists. If you had a rotten tooth, they'd yank it out, fast, painful, and probably in public. Some medieval medical manuals do mention ways to treat toothaches with herbal remedies, like clove oil or henbane. But if the pain got really bad, extraction was the only option. No Novocaine, no gentle dental chair music, just you, a barber surgeon, and a pair of pliers. Ouch. The smile standard. So what did people actually want their teeth to look like? White and even, just like today. Pale teeth were considered healthy and beautiful. Dark or missing teeth were signs of age, poverty, or illness. Of course, not everyone could maintain a perfect smile. But those who could, especially wealthy women, were praised in poetry and described in glowing terms. A lady with teeth like pearls was a common compliment. Bathing and body odor, myth versus reality. Now let's widen the scope a little. We've all heard the myth that medieval people never bathed, walking around coated in grime. The truth is much more nuanced. Bathhouses were common in many European towns during the Middle Ages. People, men and women, bathed in hot tubs, sometimes communally. Bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was also a social event. Families or friends would go together, and wealthy nobles had private baths built in their homes. Of course, not everyone bathed daily. For most, a good soak once a week was normal, with sponge baths in between. But it's a far cry from the stereotype of never washing at all. Scents and deodorizing. Still, body odor was a fact of life. To mask smells, people used herbs and perfumes. Lavender, rosemary, and rosewater were popular scents. Wealthy men and women might wear pouches of dried herbs, called pomanders, around their necks to keep themselves smelling sweet. And yes, armpit care existed. Some medieval recipes for deodorants included alum, vinegar, or even crushed herbs applied directly to the skin. Was it as effective as a stick of modern deodorant? Probably not. But it was better than nothing. Hair, nails, and other hygiene details. Clean hair was another sign of beauty, so people washed it with herbal rinses made from chamomile, rosemary, or nettles. These not only cleaned the hair but also added shine. Some rinses even claimed to lighten or darken hair color. Think of it as medieval shampoo and conditioner all in one. Nails mattered too. Dirty, broken nails looked unrefined. Wealthy people kept them trimmed and clean, sometimes polishing them with cloths. Again, not much different from us today, except their nail kits didn't come from a drugstore. Hygiene and class. As with beauty standards in general, hygiene was tied to class. The wealthy could afford perfumes, powders, and regular baths. The poor had to make do with river water and whatever herbs they could grow. That's why pale skin, clean teeth, and sweet-smelling clothes all became beauty markers. They showed you had the money and time to care about appearances. Wrapping it up. So, no, medieval people weren't toothless, filthy peasants who never brushed or bathed. They valued fresh breath, clean teeth, and pleasant smells, even if their methods were very different from ours. From tooth powders made of sage and salt, to communal bathhouses, to herbal rinses for hair, they had their own routines for staying fresh. Of course, if you did end up with a bad tooth, you'd better hope your local barber surgeon had steady hands. Let's just say medieval dentistry was more rip and pray than gentle care. Clothing as a beauty statement. When you think of medieval beauty, it's easy to picture pale faces, long flowing hair, or chivalrous knights with sculpted jawlines. But beauty in the Middle Ages wasn't just about what nature gave you, it was also about what you wore on top of it. Clothes weren't just protection from the weather, they were a full-blown statement about your wealth, your status, and your desirability. In a world where most people never saw a mirror, clothing was one of the easiest and most powerful ways to signal beauty. Let's open the medieval wardrobe and see what people used to strut their stuff. Fashion equals status. The first thing to understand about medieval fashion is that it was directly tied to social class. A nobleman in fine velvet or a lady in silk wasn't just showing off good taste, they were broadcasting wealth and privilege. Clothing acted like a medieval Instagram feed. The fabric, the cut, the colors, all of it told people who you were without you saying a word. The wealthy flaunted their riches through fashion, while the poor stuck to simple wool or linen tunics. So when we talk about beauty standards in clothing, what we're really talking about is the beauty of wealth. To be beautiful in your clothes was to look expensive. The laws of looking good. Because fashion was such a powerful status marker, rulers often stepped in with sumptuary laws. These were rules about who could wear what. For example, in England, only the nobility could wear ermine fur. In some places, purple dyes were reserved exclusively for royalty. Why? Because the upper classes didn't want commoners copying their look. Imagine being a medieval noble and spotting a farmer strolling around in your favorite shade of crimson. The horror. So if you were wealthy, beauty wasn't just about taste, it was legally protected. Your fine silks and jewel tones weren't just fashion statements, they were status armor. The shape of things. Clothing also shaped the ideal body. For women, gowns emphasized narrow waists and flowing skirts. Belts were worn high, just under the bust, to give the illusion of long legs and a graceful figure. Later, tighter-fitting bodices appeared, making the waist look even smaller. Combined with long trailing sleeves and intricate headdresses, the overall look was one of elegance and refinement. The goal wasn't necessarily to show off the body, but to elongate and stylize it. For men, tunics and hose highlighted strong legs and broad shoulders. A well-dressed man looked athletic, powerful, and ready to defend his lady, or at least look good while holding a goblet of wine. Fabrics that spoke volumes. Wool and linen were the everyday basics, but if you wanted to turn heads, you needed the good stuff. Silk was imported at great expense, and velvet made anyone look instantly luxurious. Fur linings added warmth, yes, but more importantly, they screamed wealth. Colors also mattered. Bright, deep dyes like scarlet, crimson, and royal blue were costly and therefore desirable. A noble lady in a richly dyed gown wasn't just pretty, she was practically a walking bank account. Meanwhile, peasants stuck to earthy tones, browns, grays, dull greens. Not necessarily unattractive, but certainly not the eye-catching glamour of the court. Accessories, the finishing touch. Clothing alone wasn't enough. Accessories completed the beauty package. For women, elaborate belts, jeweled brooches, and delicate girdles added sparkle. Rings and necklaces signaled wealth, while veils and headdresses framed the face in fashionable ways. Men had their own flair. Belts, decorated purses, and ornate hats all made statements. A knight might show off a beautifully tooled sword belt or a cloak clasp shaped like a lion. Shoes were another big deal. Pointed shoes, sometimes ridiculously long, came in and out of style. The longer the point, the fancier you were. At some points, nobles were strutting around with shoes so long they had to tie the tips to their legs so they wouldn't trip. Not exactly practical, but definitely a conversation starter. The armor look for knights. Armor wasn't just functional, it was fashionable. Polished metal gleaming in the sunlight made a knight look like the ultimate catch. Even the decoration mattered. Crests, engravings, and colorful surcoats all turned armor into a beauty statement. A knight in shining armor wasn't just a cliché, it was a literal standard of male attractiveness. If you could afford a perfectly fitted suit of armor, you weren't just safe on the battlefield. You were hot property at the tournament. Modesty and display. Of course, not everyone agreed on how much display was appropriate. The church often frowned on overly flashy clothes, warning that vanity was sinful. Some preachers even scolded women for wearing gowns that showed too much cleavage or men for showing off tight hose. But fashion has always pushed boundaries, hasn't it? Even in the Middle Ages, people wanted to stand out, to bend the rules, to get noticed. For every sermon against vanity, there was a noble at court showing off the latest outrageous sleeve design. The peasant look. It's easy to forget about the majority of medieval people, peasants, when we talk about beauty. For them, clothing was about survival first, style second. Woolen tunics, simple cloaks, leather shoes if you could afford them. But even peasants cared about appearances. A freshly washed tunic, a neat belt, or a splash of color from a simple dye could make someone more attractive in their village. Beauty wasn't just for the elites, it existed at every level, even if the standards looked different. Wrapping it up. So, clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just fabric. It was a beauty statement, a status symbol, and a legal marker all rolled into one. The cut of your gown, the shade of your tunic, the length of your shoes, all of it told the world who you were and whether you deserved admiration. Beauty, as always, wasn't just about nature, it was about culture, class, and cash. If you could afford silk, jewels, and long pointy shoes, you were seen as attractive and desirable. If not, you did your best with wool and linen, hoping your clean teeth and bright eyes could carry the rest. Scents and smells. When you picture the Middle Ages, you might imagine crowded streets, farm animals, and let's be honest, a lot of smells you wouldn't want bottled up and sold at a perfume counter. Life without plumbing, garbage trucks, or deodorant sprays was bound to get a little fragrant. But here's the surprise. Medieval people cared about how they smelled, and pleasant scents were an important part of beauty. In fact, fragrance was considered almost magical, a reflection of health, holiness, and even inner character. So while there were definitely some nasty odors floating around in daily life, beauty standards placed a high value on sweet smells. Let's sniff around medieval Europe and see how scent shaped attraction. Smell as beauty first. Why did scent matter so much? In a time before photos or makeup tutorials, beauty wasn't just what you saw, it was also what you smelled. A person who gave off a sweet fragrance was considered more refined, more desirable, and even more virtuous. The Church sometimes described saints as giving off miraculous scents, called the odor of sanctity. In other words, holiness itself was supposed to smell like roses or incense. On the flip side, bad smells were associated with sin, disease, or moral corruption. If you stank, people might literally think your soul was in trouble. Herbs and flowers everywhere. The easiest way to smell nice was to use herbs and flowers. People tucked sprigs of lavender, rosemary, or thyme into their clothes. Roses, violets, and lilies were also popular for their pleasant scents. Wealthy women might carry little pouches of dried herbs called pomanders, dangling from belts like medieval air fresheners. Homes, too, were scented. Floors were strewn with fresh herbs, rushes, mint, or chamomile, to release fragrance when stepped on. So even if you lived in a drafty castle, at least the hallways smelled like a spring meadow instead of damp stone. Perfume and scented waters. For those who could afford it, perfumes were a luxury beauty item. Distilled rose water, orange blossom water, or herbal infusions were dabbed on the skin. Some recipes mixed exotic imports like musk, ambergris, yes, that's from Wales, or sandalwood with local flowers. Perfumed gloves and scented clothing were another trend among the elite. Imagine shaking hands with a nobleman and realizing his gloves smelled faintly of roses. That was the medieval equivalent of flexing a luxury brand. Baths, when taken, often included scented waters. Wealthy bathers might soak in water infused with lavender or mint to leave their skin smelling fresh long after the tub was drained. Covering up the stink, of course, perfumes weren't just about beauty, they were practical. Life in a medieval town involved markets full of fish, streets full of animals, and people who didn't always bathe as often as we do today. Perfumes helped cover up unpleasant odors, especially in crowded spaces. But smelling nice wasn't just about covering up, it was about standing out. A lady at court with a delicate floral scent would seem far more refined than one who smelled like the stable. Exotic imports. Just like today, imported luxury scents were all the rage. Spices and resins brought from the Middle East or Asia were highly prized. Musk, cinnamon, cloves, myrrh, and frankincense weren't just for churches, they were blended into perfumes and oils for the wealthy. The more exotic and expensive the scent, the more it boosted your status. Wearing a perfume made with imported spices was basically like wearing a rare designer fragrance today. A way of saying, yes, I have money, and yes, I smell amazing. Men and smell. Don't think scents were just for women. Men, too, were expected to smell good, especially at court. A knight might wear perfumed oils or bathe in scented waters before attending a feast. Even armor could be lightly perfumed to keep the smell of sweat from ruining the image of a noble warrior. Wealthy men often carried pomanders just like women. And yes, perfumed beards were a thing in some regions. Oils rubbed into the hair gave it shine and fragrance. A well-groomed, nice-smelling knight? Instant medieval heartthrob. Smell and health. Here's another interesting twist. Medieval people believed smells could affect your health. This was tied to the medical theory of miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad air. To protect yourself, you surrounded yourself with good smells. Carrying herbs, wearing perfumes, or burning incense wasn't just about beauty, it was about staying alive. During plagues, people walked around with bundles of herbs under their noses, hoping the pleasant scent would keep out sickness. So smelling nice was literally seen as a matter of survival. When smell went wrong, of course, not all smells were good. Too much perfume, or scents that were too heavy, could be seen as overindulgent or even sinful. A whiff of expensive musk might impress some, but others would see it as showing off. Balance was key, sweet, subtle, and not overwhelming. And if you didn't smell nice, well, let's just say bad breath or body odor could ruin your chances at courtship. Poets rarely praised a lady's fragrance when it was garlic and onions. Everyday scents for most people, everyday scents were simple. Soap made with herbs, a sprig of mint in the clothes, maybe a rinse of rosewater if you could afford it. Peasants didn't have access to exotic perfumes, but they still appreciated the smell of clean laundry dried in the sun, or freshly cut herbs scattered on the floor. Even without luxury perfumes, scent played a role in making someone more attractive. Wrapping it up, so while the Middle Ages may not sound like the freshest smelling era, beauty standards put a high value on pleasant fragrance. Sweet smells were linked to health, holiness, and refinement, while bad odors suggested sin, disease, or poverty. Herbs, perfumes, and scented waters were tools for beauty, but also for survival and status. A nobleman's perfumed gloves or a lady's rose-scented veil could speak volumes about their wealth and refinement. In short, to be considered beautiful, you had to look good and smell good. Religious views on beauty. When we talk about beauty in the Middle Ages, we can't ignore the biggest influence of them all, the Church. Religion wasn't just a background detail, it shaped how people thought, acted, dressed, and even smelled. And when it came to beauty, the Church had plenty of opinions. Medieval Europe was deeply Christian, and ideas of beauty were tied to morality. Looking good wasn't only about personal style, it was also about how you presented your soul. Which means beauty could either be a sign of godly virtue or a dangerous temptation. Let's open the prayer book and see what religion had to say about appearances. Beauty as God's gift. First things first, beauty was often seen as a blessing from God. If someone was naturally attractive, it could be taken as a sign of divine favor. A fair face, clear skin, or graceful features weren't just physical traits, they were proof of inner goodness. Writers described saints, angels, and even the Virgin Mary in terms of radiant beauty. So physical attractiveness was connected to holiness. If you looked heavenly, people believed you might actually be closer to heaven. But wait, beauty as a trap at the same time, beauty was also viewed with suspicion. Too much focus on your looks? That was vanity, one of the classic sins. The Church warned people not to get carried away with fancy clothes, makeup, or jewelry. Beauty could be dangerous, something that tempted others to sin. A beautiful woman might be admired, but she was also often portrayed in sermons as a possible snare for men's souls. Poor medieval ladies couldn't win. If they looked good, they were virtuous, but if they looked too good, suddenly they were a threat to men's eternal salvation. Modesty, modesty, modesty. Religious leaders were big on modesty. Women were encouraged to cover their hair with veils, wimples, or hoods. The idea was to protect them, and others, from temptation. Hair, in particular, was considered dangerously alluring. A woman letting her long locks flow freely in public wasn't just being stylish, she was practically scandalous. Men, too, were expected to show modesty in their clothing. Tight hose or flashy tunics might impress at court, but preachers were quick to scold such displays as prideful. In short, modest dress was seen as the safe kind of beauty, pleasing to God, not just to human eyes. The sin of vanity. Vanity was one of the Church's favorite topics. Mirrors, cosmetics, and jewelry were often criticized. Preachers warned that spending too much time on appearances distracted from caring for your soul. There are even sermons describing women as wasting hours painting their faces while neglecting prayer. The message was clear: Worry about the state of your soul, not the state of your eyeliner. Still, people didn't stop grooming or wearing finery. The church could scold all it wanted, but fashion had its own pull. Human vanity was alive and well, even in the shadow of the cathedral. Holiness has a smell. Religion also linked beauty with fragrance. Saints were sometimes described as giving off sweet odors, the odor of sanctity. Meanwhile, sin was described as foul-smelling. This tied into the belief we saw earlier. Smelling good wasn't just attractive, it was morally uplifting. Burning incense in churches reinforced the idea that sweet smells were holy. So if you carried rosewater or lavender, it wasn't just stylish, it felt closer to godliness. Religious art and beauty. Church art also shaped beauty standards. Paintings, manuscripts, and stained glass often showed biblical figures with very specific features: pale skin, delicate hands, calm expressions. These depictions didn't just decorate churches, they influenced how people thought holy beauty should look in real life. The Virgin Mary, in particular, became the ultimate model of beauty: serene, pure, modest, and radiant. Noblewomen sometimes tried to imitate this look, using clothing, hairstyles, and even cosmetics to appear more Mary-like. Monks and nuns, the other side of beauty. On the flip side, religious life also offered an escape from beauty standards. Monks shaved their heads in the tonsure hairstyle, deliberately rejecting worldly vanity. Nuns wore plain habits and veils, covering their hair and bodies. In these settings, the goal was to move beyond physical beauty altogether and focus on spiritual beauty instead. Inner purity, not outward charm, was the real goal. That didn't mean monks and nuns didn't notice appearances, but they were supposed to prioritize the beauty of the soul over any earthly glamour. Punishments for vanity. Sometimes the church even issued direct punishments or rules about vanity. Confessors might ask people to repent for spending too much money on fancy clothing or cosmetics. In some regions, laws influenced by religious teachings limited what people could wear, especially during holy days. The idea was to protect people from pride and to keep beauty in check. Whether or not people actually followed these rules, well, human nature suggests probably not. Beauty as reflection of the soul. Ultimately, religion tied beauty to morality. A beautiful person was supposed to reflect a beautiful soul. True attractiveness wasn't about fine clothes or sparkling eyes, it was about kindness, piety, and humility. At least, that's what the preachers said. Of course, in real life, people still admired physical beauty, dressed up for festivals, and bought perfumes. But the church gave a constant reminder: beauty fades, but the soul lasts forever. Wrapping it up, religion shaped medieval beauty standards in complicated ways. On one hand, beauty was a gift from God, a reflection of holiness. On the other hand, beauty was a dangerous temptation that needed to be covered, controlled, and kept modest. The church preached against vanity and excess, but people still found ways to express style and attraction. Modest veils, perfumed gloves, and carefully chosen colors allowed people to balance piety with fashion. So, in medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just about how you looked, it was about what your looks said about your soul. In the next chapter, we'll step into the courtly world of chivalry and love poetry, where beauty wasn't just judged by priests, but celebrated in songs, stories, and romance. Courtly love and beauty. If religion preached modesty, courtly culture often did the exact opposite. By the High Middle Ages, across Europe's castles and courts, a whole new set of beauty standards bloomed, thanks to the romantic ideals of chivalry and love poetry. Here, beauty wasn't just something you had, it was something sung about, written about, and worshipped like a holy relic. Knights fought for it, poets rhymed about it, ladies glowed in the candlelight because someone had compared their eyes to stars. Courtly love culture turned beauty into an art form, wrapped up in manners, rituals, and lots of exaggerated compliments. Troubadours and poets in southern France. Troubadours wrote poems praising noblewomen as the epitome of beauty and grace. They described golden hair, bright eyes, flawless skin, and delicate movements. These weren't casual lines, either. This was full-on admiration, sometimes bordering on worship. One common image was the lady compared to the dawn or the morning star, her beauty so radiant it lit up the entire court. Never mind that she probably just had a decent hair braid and a good gown in verse, she was practically glowing like the sun itself. These poems shaped ideals. Fair skin, light hair, slim figures, and elegant gestures became hallmarks of noble beauty. Knights and chivalry knights, of course, had their own role in this culture. They weren't just warriors, they were expected to be lovers, too. Courtly love demanded that a knight devote himself to a lady, often one above his social station, and show his loyalty through service, poetry, or even duels. And beauty was central. A knight might carry his lady's scarf into battle as a token of her charm. He might proclaim her the most beautiful woman in the world, whether or not anyone else agreed. Her beauty became his inspiration, his fuel for bravery. Beauty as inspiration. The whole idea of courtly love was that beauty elevated people. Admiring a beautiful lady supposedly made a knight more noble, more courageous, and more refined. Beauty wasn't just about appearances, it was fuel for moral and spiritual improvement. Sure, it was a little over the top, but in the medieval imagination, beauty had power. A lovely face could inspire better manners, braver deeds, and more eloquent poetry. Unrealistic standards? Of course, all this poetry created some pretty unrealistic expectations. Courtly love ideals often praised ladies who were impossibly perfect, flawless skin, golden hair, angelic voices. Real medieval women probably rolled their eyes at being compared to roses blooming in snow. But ideals have power. The repeated images of pale, golden-haired, slim women shaped how people thought of beauty in noble circles. Even if most women didn't fit that exact description, the poems kept reinforcing the picture. Rules of the game. Courtly love had rules. A lady was supposed to be modest yet beautiful, aloof yet kind, inspiring but often unattainable. The knight, meanwhile, was expected to remain devoted and to prove his worth through service. The lady's beauty wasn't just physical, it was tied to her manners, her speech, and her refinement. A beautiful lady who was rude or unkind would ruin the illusion. Courtly culture demanded beauty of body and character. Festivals and displays. These ideals weren't limited to poems. Festivals, tournaments, and dances gave nobles chances to display their beauty. Ladies dressed in their finest gowns, often with elaborate hair and jewels, while knights showed off polished armor and graceful horsemanship. It was a stage, really. Beauty was on display as part of the performance of nobility. A lady watching a joust wasn't just a spectator, she was the prize, her beauty the reason knights clashed lances in the first place. Love as refinement. Writers at the time argued that loving a beautiful lady made men better. A knight who admired a noblewoman would try to speak more elegantly, behave more politely, and fight more bravely. Beauty, in this view, was a civilizing force. So while religion sometimes warned against physical beauty, courtly culture celebrated it as uplifting, even transformative. The double standards. As usual, women carried more of the burden. They were expected to embody the ideals of beauty and grace, often without much say in the matter. Men could admire and chase, but women were supposed to inspire without appearing too available. Still, courtly love gave women a certain power. Being admired for beauty gave them influence, even if it was symbolic. A lady's glance, a smile, or a favor could set knights on quests. Beauty, once again, was a form of power. Beyond the court, did peasants write love poetry about each other's beauty? Probably not in the same grandiose way. But even outside castles, beauty and romance mattered. Folk songs and village festivals celebrated attractive features: rosy cheeks, bright eyes, strong hands. Courtly love ideals were mostly for the elite, but the idea that beauty could inspire love trickled down in simpler ways. Wrapping it up, courtly love made beauty into a poetic masterpiece. Knights and poets described ladies as glowing stars, roses, and goddesses, setting unrealistic but powerful standards of attractiveness. Beauty wasn't just physical, it was noble, refined, and inspiring. At court, beauty became a game of admiration, a performance of status, and a tool of influence. While religion urged modesty, courtly poets elevated beauty to something almost divine. In the next chapter, we'll shift from poetry and ideals to the real, everyday side of things, how medieval beauty standards affected ordinary people, especially peasants. Because while knights were writing sonnets, farmers were just trying to keep their hands clean. Beauty standards for peasants versus nobles. So far, we've spent a lot of time peeking into castles and courts, watching nobles strut around in silk and perfume while knights recite poetry about ladies who shine like the dawn. But what about everyone else? After all, most people in medieval Europe weren't nobles. They were peasants, farmers, shepherds, laborers, living in villages, working long hours, and trying to survive. Here's the thing: beauty standards weren't the same for everyone. Nobles had their ideals, shaped by luxury and poetry. Peasants had a different reality, shaped by practicality, survival, and community life. Let's see how beauty looked from both sides of the medieval social ladder. Nobles, the luxury of looking good. For nobles, beauty was tied to wealth and refinement. Pale skin, delicate hands, long flowing hair, these were all signs of a life of leisure. Noble women avoided the sun to keep their skin fair, showing they didn't have to work outside. Noblemen were admired for athletic builds and polished appearances, signaling strength but also refinement. And because nobles had access to mirrors, perfumes, imported fabrics, and cosmetics, they could afford to shape their looks according to the latest fashions. Their beauty was performative, carefully curated to fit ideals set by poetry, religion, and courtly etiquette. Peasants, practical beauty. For peasants, life was different. Working in the fields meant sun-darkened skin, rough hands, and sturdy builds. Beauty here wasn't about delicate refinement, it was about health and strength. A peasant man with strong arms and a solid frame was attractive because he could plow fields, chop wood, and provide for a family. A woman with rosy cheeks and sturdy health was admired because she could work, bear children, and survive the hardships of village life. So while nobles praised fair skin, peasants often valued the glow of outdoor health. Practicality mattered more than poetry. Cleanliness counts. Don't imagine peasants as constantly filthy, though. People valued cleanliness at every level of society. A washed face, clean hair, and neat clothing went a long way toward attractiveness, even in a village. Bathing wasn't daily, but people did wash in rivers, ponds, or with basins of water. So a peasant turning up at a festival in a freshly washed tunic and with combed hair could absolutely be considered beautiful in their community. It wasn't silk gowns or perfumed gloves, but it was the village equivalent. Clothing differences: nobles wore silks, velvets, and bright dyes. Peasants wore wool, linen, and simple colors like browns, grays, and earthy greens. But peasants still had festive clothes. A well-made tunic, a brightly dyed scarf, or a decorated belt could be a big deal on special occasions. Beauty wasn't just about fabric, it was about effort. Even in a humble village, people noticed when someone dressed up for a feast day or dance. Hair and grooming. Noblewomen had time for elaborate braids, veils, and jeweled headdresses. Peasant women often kept their hair simpler, tied back for work. But on holidays, they might braid it neatly, add ribbons, or wear flowers as decoration. For men, nobles could perfume and oil their hair, while peasants might just keep it trimmed or tied. Still, a well-kept beard or freshly shaved face was appreciated across classes. Grooming was universal, even if the tools were different. Teeth and smiles. Teeth were another area where standards varied. Nobles sometimes used powders to keep teeth clean, but peasants relied on rinsing with water or rubbing with herbs. A bright smile was attractive everywhere, though healthy teeth and fresh breath made a difference whether you were in a castle hall or a village square. Festivals and beauty on display. The biggest times beauty standards showed up among peasants were festivals, weddings, and market days. These were occasions to wear your best clothes, wash up, and maybe even flirt. A young man might show off by dancing or playing music, while a young woman might wear flowers in her hair. It wasn't as glamorous as courtly love poetry, but it was just as important. Beauty in the village was about being noticed, admired, and maybe securing a good marriage. Shared ideals. Despite the differences, there was some overlap. Both nobles and peasants admired clear skin, healthy bodies, and pleasant smells when possible. Both liked bright eyes, thick hair, and cleanliness. And both associated beauty with health, whether that meant delicate refinement or strong sturdiness. So while the details differed, the core idea was the same. Beauty was about showing you were desirable, capable, and part of your community. The double standard of work. One of the biggest differences was how work shaped appearance. For peasants, sun-darkened skin and strong bodies were normal. For nobles, those same traits were undesirable because they suggested labor. So the same feature, say, tanned skin, might be seen as healthy and attractive in a village, but as unrefined at court. Beauty was deeply tied to social class, and the standards weren't universal. Wrapping it up, in medieval Europe, nobles and peasants had very different beauty standards. Nobles emphasized refinement, pale skin, and luxury. Peasants valued health, strength, and practicality. Both cared about cleanliness, grooming, and making a good impression, but the details depended on your daily life. Beauty wasn't one size fits all. It was shaped by class, work, and community. What made someone beautiful in a castle hall wasn't the same as what made someone attractive at a village dance. Beauty in different cultures. Europe versus the Middle East and Asia. So far, we've been wandering through medieval Europe, peeking into castles, cathedrals, and peasant cottages to see what counted as beautiful. But of course, Europe wasn't the whole medieval world. Across the Middle East, India, China, and beyond, other cultures had their own unique beauty ideals, some surprisingly similar to Europe's and some wildly different. Let's take a little journey eastward and see how beauty standards compared. The Middle East. Perfume and eyes that speak. In the Islamic world of the Middle Ages, beauty was celebrated in poetry, art, and everyday life. Just like in Europe, fragrance was a huge deal. But here, perfumes weren't just luxuries, they were part of daily hygiene and religious ritual. Musk, rosewater, sandalwood, and jasmine were common scents, making people smell heavenly in bustling cities like Baghdad or Cairo. Eyes were another focus. Poets praised dark, expressive eyes framed by long lashes. Kohl eyeliner, made from powdered minerals, was used by both men and women. It made the eyes stand out dramatically, and it also had the practical benefit of reducing glare from the sun. Soft skin, well-groomed hair, and a graceful walk were all admired. And while modesty was important, veils and coverings often emphasized it, beauty still shone through in subtle ways. A glimpse of elegant hands or kohl-lined eyes could be just as powerful as a whole gown in a European court. Persia and the art of refinement. Persian poetry and art painted beauty in almost dreamlike terms. Poets like Hafez or Rumi often described beloveds as having faces like the moon, lips like rubies, and hair as dark as night. Pale, radiant skin was admired, but the key feature was refinement, graceful movement, delicate gestures, and a calm, serene presence. Here, beauty wasn't just about physical traits, it was tied to manners, charm, and eloquence. Someone who could recite poetry, play music, and move with elegance was considered truly attractive. India. Hair, jewelry, and bright colors. In medieval India, beauty standards were deeply tied to both Hindu traditions and local customs. Thick, dark, glossy hair was a major symbol of beauty. Women often oiled their hair with coconut or sesame oil to keep it shiny and strong. Long braids decorated with flowers or jewelry were admired, especially during festivals. Jewelry played a massive role. Gold bangles, anklets, nose rings, and jeweled bindis weren't just accessories, they were beauty statements. The more ornaments you wore, the more dazzling you appeared. Brightly colored fabrics, saris and tunics dyed in reds, oranges, and yellows, added to the vibrancy. Unlike Europe, where pale skin was prized, in many parts of India healthy glowing skin, regardless of tone, was associated with beauty and prosperity. China. Grace, pale skin, and tiny feet. In medieval China, beauty standards revolved around elegance, delicacy, and refinement. Pale skin was highly prized, just as in Europe, because it showed a life free from outdoor labor. Women used powders to lighten their skin and sometimes even wore veils to avoid tanning. Hair was another focus, long, black, and shiny, often styled into intricate buns or adorned with hairpins. Graceful movement was essential. The way a woman walked, bowed, or poured tea all added to her beauty. And yes, by the later medieval period, foot binding had begun among the upper classes. Tiny feet were considered a sign of refinement and attractiveness, though the practice was painful and restrictive. To outsiders it might seem strange, but in context, it was tied to ideals of delicacy and status. Japan. Beauty and subtlety. In medieval Japan, especially during the Heian period, beauty had its own unique twist. Noblewomen painted their faces white with rice powder, blackened their teeth, yes, this was fashionable, and plucked or reshaped their eyebrows. Why black teeth? It sounds odd to us, but it was considered elegant and a sign of maturity. Combined with the pale skin and red lips, it created a striking contrast. Long, flowing black hair, sometimes so long it reached the floor, was another admired feature. Clothing was all about layers of silk, with colors carefully chosen to reflect the season or mood. Beauty here wasn't flashy, but carefully curated, artistic, and subtle. Comparing cultures. When you put all these beauty standards side by side, some similarities pop up. Pale skin was admired in Europe, China, and Persia. Perfume was prized in both Europe and the Middle East. Long, well-kept hair was valued almost everywhere. But there were differences, too. In India, jewelry and bright colors were central, while in Europe, noble modesty often called for muted tones. In Japan, painted faces and blackened teeth created a very different look from Europe's rosy cheeks and golden hair. So beauty really was in the eye of the beholder, and in the customs of the culture. What one region considered stunning, another might find puzzling. What they thought of each other. Interestingly, when cultures met through trade, travel, or war, they sometimes commented on each other's beauty. European crusaders in the Middle East admired the perfumes and exotic looks they encountered. Merchants brought back stories of silk-clad Chinese women with delicate features. Meanwhile, Asian travelers often found Europeans surprisingly hairy and pale. So even in the Middle Ages, beauty was global, different ideals clashing, blending, and sometimes just being marveled at. Wrapping it up, beauty in the medieval world wasn't one size fits all. In Europe, it was pale skin, long hair, and modesty. In the Middle East, it was expressive eyes, fragrance, and elegance. In India, it was vibrant jewelry and thick hair. In China and Japan, it was delicacy, pale skin, and careful artistry. What's clear is that everywhere, beauty was tied to culture, class, and symbolism. It wasn't just about looking good, it was about showing who you were, where you came from, and what values your society admired. Art and literature's influence on beauty. If you've ever scrolled through Instagram and noticed how the same look seems to pop up over and over again. Plump lips, sharp brows, perfectly styled hair, you'll understand the medieval world a little better. Back then, instead of influencers and filters, people had poets, painters, and storytellers shaping their ideas of beauty. Art and literature didn't just reflect what people thought was attractive, they actively told people what they should think was beautiful. In a way, medieval bards and artists were the original trendsetters. The role of poets, words as beauty filters. Let's start with poetry. Medieval poets loved describing beauty in exaggerated, flowery language. A woman's skin wasn't just pale, it was like snow on the mountain. Her lips weren't just red, they were roses dipped in wine. Her hair? Golden threads spun by the sun itself. If you think that sounds dramatic, it was. Poets had a way of turning ordinary features into cosmic wonders. A knight who read a poem about a lady with eyes brighter than twin stars would go into court expecting to find women who looked like they walked straight out of the Milky Way. This set impossible standards, of course, but it also meant that everyone had a mental picture of what ideal beauty was supposed to be. Courtly love and the dream girl. Much of this poetry was tied to the tradition of courtly love. Knights and troubadours sang about unattainable ladies with perfect features, ladies who were usually married to someone else and totally out of reach. These stories weren't really about real women at all. They were about ideals, purity, elegance, nobility. But the way these dream girls were described shaped how actual women were judged. If the poets said the perfect lady had golden hair and dainty hands, guess what women started trying to emphasize? Their golden hair and dainty hands. It was like every court had its own medieval Pinterest board of dream girl aesthetics. Artists and painters, beauty and brushstrokes. Visual art played a similar role. If you look at medieval paintings, especially religious ones, you'll notice that saints and the Virgin Mary often share similar features: pale skin, delicate faces, serene expressions. These weren't accidental. They reflected what people thought was holy, and by extension, beautiful. In Italy, for instance, artists during the later medieval and early Renaissance periods often painted women with high foreheads, light skin, and long necks. That wasn't just an artistic choice, it was also a signal of the ideal female look. Of course, these portraits were also flattering. Wealthy patrons who commissioned them wanted to look their best, so artists made sure their sitters were depicted according to the beauty standards of the time. If your forehead wasn't high enough, no problem, the painter could edit it with his brush, just like a medieval Photoshop. Chivalric romances. Beauty as plot device. In medieval literature, beauty wasn't just decoration, it often drove the story. A knight might go on a dangerous quest because he saw a lady so beautiful it left him breathless. A king might risk war because he wanted to marry a queen described as fairer than any jewel. Beauty was power, and stories made sure to highlight it. In many cases, a character's appearance signaled their role in the plot. Beautiful meant good, virtuous, and noble. Ugly or deformed usually meant wicked, sneaky, or cursed. This might sound harsh, but it was part of the storytelling logic of the time. Beauty and morality were tangled up together. Music and song. Singing praises of pretty faces. Let's not forget music. Troubadours and minstrels sang ballads that praised beauty in the most dramatic ways possible. Think of them as the medieval version of love songs on the radio. Only instead of Beyoncé or Ed Sheeran, you had some guy with a lute singing about the radiant eyes of Lady Eleanor. These songs traveled, too. A ballad could spread across regions, carrying its beauty ideals with it. Soon, entire areas were humming the same tune about long golden hair or rosy cheeks. Music reinforced what paintings and poetry already shouted from the rooftops. This is what you should find beautiful. The power of the church's imagery. Religious art also reinforced beauty ideals, but with a twist. While saints and angels were portrayed as radiant, virtuous, and, yes, beautiful, the devil and demons were often painted as grotesque. This wasn't just about scaring people, it was about creating a visual code. Holiness was linked to beauty, sin to ugliness. That meant keeping yourself looking presentable and pure wasn't just a matter of style, it felt like a spiritual duty. Did everyone buy into it? Of course, not everyone had access to portraits or fancy poetry. The average peasant wasn't sitting around reading courtly romances. But beauty ideals trickled down. Ballads sung in villages carried the imagery, church paintings were seen by everyone, and local gossip always picked up trends from the wealthy. Even if a peasant girl didn't own a mirror, she knew pale skin was prized. Even if a farmer didn't read poetry, he knew that noblewomen were described as slim and graceful. Ideals reached everyone in one form or another. A medieval media machine. When you think about it, medieval art and literature worked a lot like today's media. Instead of billboards and TikTok, people had church walls, illuminated manuscripts, traveling musicians, and wandering poets. But the effect was the same. They told people what was beautiful, they reinforced it over and over, and they made sure everyone knew the standard, even if they couldn't reach it. Wrapping it up in the end, medieval beauty wasn't just about looking a certain way. It was about fitting into a cultural script written by poets, painted by artists, and sung by musicians. If the art said pale skin, golden hair, and dainty hands were beautiful, then that became the ideal, whether you were a noble in France or a villager in England. So next time you see a medieval painting of a serene, pale lady with delicate features, remember, she was basically the cover model of her time, shaped by a powerful mix of poetry, painting, and song. Comparing then and now, medieval beauty meets the modern world. We've taken quite a long stroll through the medieval world. Castles, churches, markets, and even poetry readings, and we've seen how beauty standards shaped the lives of people back then. But let's pause for a moment. How do those medieval ideals compare with the ones we live with today? Spoiler: some things have changed a lot. Others not so much. Pale skin then, tanned skin now. One of the biggest differences is skin tone preferences. In medieval Europe, pale skin was the thing. If you looked like you hadn't seen the sun in a decade, people thought you were wealthy, refined, and probably too important to do farm work. Fast forward to today, and it's almost flipped. In many modern cultures, a tan is considered attractive, like proof that you've just come back from a beach vacation. It suggests leisure and freedom, ironically, the same role pale skin once played in the Middle Ages. Back then, pale skin said, "I am rich enough to avoid work." Now, a tan says, "I am rich enough to take time off work." Different eras, same logic. Hair goals, medieval blondes versus modern trends. In medieval Europe, blonde hair was practically worshipped. Poets raved about it, paintings highlighted it, and women went to great lengths to bleach their hair with weird concoctions. Today, hair trends change with the seasons. Blonde is still popular, but so is jet black, fiery red, or rainbow-colored. Thanks to dye, extensions, and an endless supply of hair products, the variety is endless. But the underlying theme hasn't changed much. hair is still a major beauty symbol. If your hair looks good, people notice. If it looks bad, well, hats exist for a reason. Makeup then versus makeup now. Medieval cosmetics were often risky, lead-based powders, mercury concoctions, and even arsenic. All in the name of pale skin and rosy cheeks. Modern makeup is safer, thankfully, but the goal is surprisingly similar: enhance eyes, cheeks, and lips. Contour kits, highlighters, and lip gloss are just the high-tech descendants of medieval rouges and powders. And let's be honest, people still fall for dangerous beauty hacks today. Whether it's weird TikTok challenges or untested creams, the anything for beauty mindset is alive and well. The ideal body. Shifting shapes. Medieval ideals for the body varied, but in many places, a fuller figure was admired. It meant health, fertility, and wealth. Thinness wasn't the goal. In fact, being too thin could be seen as a sign of illness or poverty. Compare that to today, where trends bounce back and forth. One decade, it's super thin heroin chic. Another decade, it's curvy, hourglass shapes. Add in fitness culture, and suddenly toned abs are the new standard. The key similarity? Bodies have always been judged and idealized, and the standards keep shifting. It's less about health and more about cultural storytelling. Smells then and now. Perfume and good scents were prized in the Middle Ages, just as they are today. The difference is that now we can shower every morning, while medieval folks often had to make do with scented oils and flowers to cover up, let's call it, natural musk. Still, the idea is the same: smelling nice is a form of beauty. Whether it's rosewater in a medieval court or designer cologne in a modern office, fragrance has never gone out of style. Fashion cycles. Medieval fashion emphasized rich fabrics, layered clothing, and colors that showed off wealth. Today, brand names, sneakers, and tailored outfits do the same. Clothing is still one of the quickest ways to signal beauty and status. The difference? In the Middle Ages, laws literally restricted who could wear certain fabrics or colors. Today, you can buy whatever you want, but your wallet might not agree. The role of media back then: beauty ideals spread through poetry, paintings, and songs. Today, they spread through movies, Instagram, TikTok, and ads. But the function hasn't changed. Media tells us what's trendy, what's in, and what to aspire to. The big difference is scale. A medieval village might have one painting in a church that everyone saw. Now, billions of people scroll through thousands of images daily. The pressure is much more constant and global. Technology joins the party. Let's not forget, in medieval times, people didn't have Botox, fillers, cosmetic surgery, or Photoshop. Their filters were powders, veils, and flattering poetry. Today, technology has exploded beauty standards wide open. You can alter your body, filter your face, and present a polished version of yourself online that medieval nobles could only dream of. But with that comes a whole new layer of pressure, because if everyone looks perfect online, the bar keeps rising. Similarities that never die. Despite all the differences, a few themes remain constant: youth is prized. Then as now, smooth skin and vitality are linked to beauty. Symmetry matters. Humans have always admired balanced, even features. Status is tied to beauty. Whether it's pale skin showing nobility or a luxury brand bag showing wealth, beauty ideals almost always point back to social class. A reflection: why it matters. So, what can we take away from all this? Beauty standards are not timeless truths. They are cultural stories, shifting and reshaping with economics, technology, and values. What counted as gorgeous in 1200 might be laughed at today, and what we think is stunning now might look bizarre to people 500 years from now. But through it all, humans keep chasing beauty. Whether it's medieval ladies painting their faces with dangerous powders or modern influencers contouring for the perfect selfie, the quest to look good, and to be seen as good, never really ends. Wrapping up the whole journey, and that's it, our trip through medieval beauty standards and beyond. We've seen pale skin obsessions, golden hair goals, dangerous makeup hacks, perfumed courts, and poetry that turned ordinary features into celestial wonders. We've also seen how beauty was never just about looks. It was about class, morality, religion, and identity. It told people who they were and where they stood. In the end, beauty, whether in medieval Europe, the Middle East, or modern TikTok culture, is less about universal truth and more about human imagination.